Jesus, bread of life, I pray thee, let me gladly hear, obey thee. Amen. Friends, please indulge me for a moment, and please be seated, friends behind me. We're still getting used to some of these things in life. Indulge me for a moment, friends, to offer a bit of an aside before I dive into my full reflections on this morning's gospel text. In the course of our Friday Bible study, our Friday study of this gospel, every Friday at noon, we gather for a little lunch hour Bible study to explore the upcoming gospel. And in the course of this Friday's discussion, someone asked an important question that I think bears a little reflection briefly. The question was, were there any good or decent chief priests and elders and Pharisees? Were any of them good? Now, first, there's the technical answer. Of course. We may remember, of course, Nicodemus, who throughout the life of Jesus is kind of weaving in and out as a disciple and being one of those who is at his death, and even with Joseph of Arimathea at his burial. But even more, there is this temptation in our world today, and it bears with a bit of what I'll say later. There's this temptation in our world today to almost demonize, so polarize our society that if you aren't with me, you're against me, and if you're not with me, you are indecent, or bad, or even evil. And so it is really important for us to recognize that even in the person on the other side of the wall, the fence, whatever it may be that divides us, there is a decent human being, a child of God. It's a critical reality, a critical need for us today to recognize that even among the chief priests, those who are questioning Jesus in this very encounter, saying to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority? How dare you? What right do you have to be here? It's critical for us to realize that in that person is a child of God. In that person is a decent human being. And that leads me, I think, a bit into the reflections I had prepared for us this morning. You see, friends, I think we are at a critical point in our life, not as a church, but we're related to it, but as a human and certainly American society. I believe that today we are facing a crisis as an American society unlike any crisis that we've seen before, or any other crisis that perhaps may come. And no, that crisis is not COVID-19, though serious that is. How tragically we have lost over 200,000 lives in American society and countless more the world over. COVID-19 and the coronavirus present a critical crisis to both American and global societies. But that's not the crisis that I'm speaking of today. Nor is it the crisis of that awaits us with the appointment of the next Supreme Court justice to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, may she rest in peace. Despite the fact that that decision will impact the American justice system for generations to come, it is not the crisis that I think stands before us most critically today. Nor is it the crisis of our upcoming election on November 3rd. The threats of mail-in ballot fraud and absentee ballots and the questions that are swirling around us as we consider who and what individuals, not only the president, but Senate and House of Representatives, individuals that will lead us as a nation, in spite of the fact that those individuals will make critical decisions about our health care, about our retirement and care in critical points of our lives, the legality and not even just the legality, the value, decency, and equality of our gay and lesbian sisters and brothers, the value and equality of all faces in American society, regardless of the color of their skin or their gender. It's not the critical crisis that I see in front of us. It's not even the climate crisis that is brewing on the edge of the horizon of our global society. The crisis that stands before us today is a crisis of relationship. We seem no longer to possess the ability to be in relationship with a person with whom we disagree. We don't have to call them enemy, but we treat them as such. If you do not see the value of what I see, if you do not agree with the position that I hold dear, you are not worthy of me. And how equally that is, and so often, the case in reverse. At the heart of the crises that are facing us, from climate change to Supreme Court justice appointments to voting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden, to the appointment of a Supreme Court justice, behind every single one of those crises lies an even more fundamental one: our inability to live in relationship with the person with whom we disagree. And perhaps even more fundamentally, our inability to have a civil dialogue with him or with her. That certainly was at the heart of the case with the appointment, the nomination of Merrick Garland 4 years ago. So divided is our political system that we couldn't even have the conversation about his nomination, let alone a decision to affirm or not confirm his appointment. It is why I think we see so many signs on our lawns, Biden and Trump and Biden all over the place, as if we're yelling at one another, but unable to actually have a conversation about why I stand with Mr. Trump or why I stand with Mr. Biden. We're unable to have a civil conversation about matters of utter importance with the person with whom we disagree. And so I am grateful today that we have this text before us, because at the heart of it is a question about how does Jesus engage those with whom he disagrees? How does he agree with him? We can get stuck on the question and the content of the disagreement, but at the very heart of it is the disagreement itself. And we will see, if we look back through the life of Jesus, that this is a common theme, in fact, with Jesus. Throughout his life and his ministry, almost from the very get-go, if you take from his baptism the confrontation that he has with Satan in the desert that immediately follows, all the way to the cross and beyond, we will see that woven throughout his life is conflict with others. Not conflict that he chooses, but conflict, I dare say, that is simply natural to human relationship. And what we see, I contend, is a better way forward. So let's dive in for a moment. Here they are. Jesus comes into the temple, the chief priests are there, the elders are there, and they come to him. They come to him, it seems, seeking a fight. By what authority, they say to him, by what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority? You can imagine what that might feel like. Somebody coming up to you in your workplace or your home and saying, who gave you the right to be here, to make this decision? How dare you? Who are you to make that decision for me, for us, for our society? You can hear echoes, perhaps, of it in our current day politics. There it is. From the very get-go, the conflict is laid bare. And at that very moment, in fact, Jesus has a choice. There are, it seems, 3 paths before him. He chooses one, but let's name the others that are there as well, the choices that we would all face, and perhaps the choices we have all faced when confronted with such conflict in our own lives. Of course, one option for Jesus would have been to simply walk away, to ignore the problem, to ignore the conflict, to ignore the person standing before him, to dismiss them outright. It's almost as if you can imagine it, somebody knocking on the door and saying, "Did you hear that?" "No, I don't think it was just a squirrel or something outside." No. But we do that so often, don't we? Someone's crying out in the wilderness for us to respond, and we just ignore them. We dismiss them. We're hearing it today. We dismiss Mr. Trump's followers, if you will, those who are standing with him, aggrieved and calling out for a change to American society that they're afraid of is occurring. We dismiss them all too often as racist and bigots when they're crying out for something. We may not agree with what they're crying out for. We may not agree with the fear that they're facing, but they're crying out nonetheless. How often we dismiss them and walk away. The same, too, for the family of Breonna Taylor or George Floyd and African-American brothers and sisters and brown brothers and sisters in American society. How often we just dismiss them. They're rioters, right? They're looters and pillagers and violent anti-fascists. We have no need of them. But at the end of the day, to both, we're saying, we won't listen to you. We're going to ignore you. We're going to dismiss you and walk away. Jesus could have done that. He could have ignored. He could have said, "You chief priests have no authority yourselves." But he doesn't. Now, there's another option that we often choose as well. We may not ignore it, the conflict, when it's presented to us. At times, we forcefully respond to it. Not necessarily with physical violence. I pray not with physical violence, but we do violence in other ways. We raise our voices. We become, particularly men in our society, we become big and domineering. We stand over and expect another to accept our position just because we have a bigger voice or a stronger muscle with which to enforce it. We make threats about what we might do, what you will lose if you don't change your position, all in order to get another to agree with us. We threaten, we cost, we intimidate, all in the name of agreement. We see that in our society, and no doubt as well, sadly, we see it in our homes as well. But you'll notice that Jesus chooses neither of these options. He chooses to do something remarkably difficult. He stays present, first and foremost. He doesn't walk away. He doesn't dismiss the chief priests or the elders. He doesn't diminish them for their questions. He doesn't dismiss or diminish their challenge to him. He has the ability to stay present and engaged. That is perhaps the first expression of love in conflict, that we don't walk away. Do you have the ability? It is as if when we are in conflict, the person with whom we're in conflict with, the person who is angry at me or dismissive of me, that person is asking, do you have the capacity to love me, to stay with me, even now? If we look at a couple of other stories that we encounter, a couple of weeks ago we had Jesus and the woman from Tyre and Sidon. Remember that story? She's asking for healing for her daughter. Jesus says, dismissively at first. I'm not here. I'm here for the children of Israel. I'm not here for Gentiles. But she challenges him. She disagrees with him. She stays present to him. And he does something remarkable. He amends his ways. It is as if he is saying to her, I have the capacity to love you so much that I am willing to listen to you, and when right, to change my ways. Do we have that capacity with our neighbor? With the Trump voter or the Biden voter? To listen to them with such respect, with such compassion and love that we're willing to hear what they have right in order that we might change and grow ourselves. Of course, there's also that remarkable encounter between Jesus and Judas on that fateful night as Judas goes out into the darkness to betray Jesus and to turn him over into the hands of the chief priests and the elders that Jesus is confronting today. There in that critical night, as Jesus hands Judas the bread of life, and he looks into his eyes knowing that he is about to go out to depart into that night to betray him, Jesus again has a critical decision to make about what life is like with somebody with whom you are in conflict. Will you allow them to leave? Will you allow them to be in such conflict with you that they will stand opposite you, even at times hurt you, betray you? Will you, in a sense, allow the other to be themselves, human, imperfect, and different than you? And so Jesus allows Judas to go, in spite of the conflict and the suffering that he will bring. But then there's one more story about conflict in relationship. Remember, too, the conflict between Jesus and Peter. Peter, too, goes out into that night, and 3 times he says, I do not know the man. 3 times he denies being in relationship to Jesus. 3 times he leaves Jesus to suffer at the hands of his persecutors, the soldiers, the centurions, alone. And here's the question for Jesus. Do you love Peter enough when he has hurt you, when he has failed you, when his love has been imperfect for you? Do you have the capacity to return to him? And so we see in a few days' time, Jesus returned to Peter upon the Sea of Tiberias, the shore of the Sea of Tiberias, to ask Peter those 3 questions. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Throughout all of these stories, we see Jesus living through conflict with others. Conflict with those who are dear to him. Peter and Judas, conflict with strangers, a woman from Tyre and Sidon, the chief priests and the elders of Jerusalem. Conflict is natural to our human relationships because we are independent people. To stand beside somebody is to stand beside an independent being, someone fundamentally different than you, who will possess not only different behaviors, different values, different thoughts and ideas. And so we must find a way to live in relationship, not with those whom we love, but those who differ from us. And it is love alone that will overcome that difference and hold us together. It is love alone that will enable us to have those conversations, civil conversations with those who we disagree, because we bring love to that conversation. We bring love by staying present to it, by valuing the questions that another brings, by being open to their opinions, their insights and learnings in order that we might change on account of them, being willing to let them stand independently even when they will disappoint or, dare I say, hurt us. And finally, being willing to return to them when they have. Friends, we are facing We are in the face of an American crisis, inability to have simple civil conversation with one another. But that inability is plaguing all aspects of our human society, our American life. We must change. Not only must we make different decisions, we can talk all we want about those decisions, but we must relearn the capacity to disagree in love in order that we might become a more beloved society together. Amen.